The crowd outside Buckingham Palace was massive that Tuesday afternoon. Tourists pressed against the iron gates, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Street vendors sold flags and postcards. The air hummed with anticipation, but no one expected what was about to happen. Among the spectators stood a man in a worn Joker costume, paint cracked on his face. His purple suit was faded and patched. He carried a small accordion and a wooden sign that read, "Music for Memories." People gave him space, not out of respect. Out of discomfort. He looked out of place. Too strange. Too sad. His name was Thomas Webb, 53 years old. Once a professional street performer who drew crowds across London, now just a ghost of that man, playing for coins on cold pavements. The royal guards stood at their posts, perfectly still, red uniforms pristine, black bearskin hats, tall and imposing, faces frozen in disciplined neutrality. They were trained to ignore everything. Hecklers, tourists, noise, nothing could break. Their focus, Thomas had seen them before, watched them for weeks. He wasn't there for money. He was there for something else. Something deeper. If you're already hooked by this story, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next will absolutely move you. Thomas stepped forward slowly. The crowd noticed. Whispers spread. What was he doing? You couldn't approach the guards. Everyone knew that. Security would remove him immediately, but Thomas didn't rush. He moved with quiet purpose, accordion strapped across his chest. He stopped 10 feet from the nearest guard. A young man, mid-20s, standing at attention with a rifle at his side. The guard's eyes stared. Straight ahead, unseeing, unmoving. Thomas raised the accordion. His fingers cracked and weathered, found the keys, and he began to play. The melody was simple, soft. It drifted through the noise of the crowd like smoke. An old folk song. The kind grandmothers hummed while baking bread. The kind that carried weight without words. People stopped talking, turned to watch. Something about the moment felt sacred. The guard didn't move. His training held firm, but Thomas kept playing. His eyes closed. The music flowed from somewhere deeper than technique. From memory. From the place where grief lives quietly until someone gives it permission to speak. 3 minutes passed. The crowd grew larger. Phones came out. People filmed, sensing they were witnessing something unusual. Security guards at the palace gate exchanged glances. Protocol said to remove disruptions. But this didn't feel like a disruption. It felt like something else. Thomas finished the song. Silence hung heavy for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He lowered his accordion, straightened his shoulders despite the weight of years pressing down on them. And he saluted. Not a casual gesture. A proper military salute. Crisp, respectful, holding it steady despite. His trembling hand, the crowd held its breath. The royal guard stood frozen, still staring ahead, still bound by duty, but then something impossible happened. The guard's eyes shifted. Just barely. Just enough to acknowledge the man in the Joker costume standing before him. His jaw tightened. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. And then slowly, with the weight of every rule he was breaking. The guard brought his white-gloved hand to his temple. He returned the salute. The crowd gasped. Cameras flashed. Tourists murmured in disbelief. This never happened. Guards didn't break protocol. They didn't respond. They didn't acknowledge anyone. But this guard did. Thomas held his salute for 3 more seconds. The guard held his. 2 men, separated by uniform and circumstance, connected by something the crowd couldn't see. Then Thomas lowered his hand, nodded once, turned, and walked away, accordion hanging heavy at his side. The guard snapped back to attention, staring forward again, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Security moved through the crowd, not to arrest Thomas, but to manage the spectators pressing forward with questions. Who was that man? Why did the guards salute him? What just happened? No one had answers. Thomas disappeared into the London streets, his purple costume swallowed by the afternoon shadows. The crowd buzzed with speculation. Videos were already uploading to social media. Within an hour, the footage would be viral. But Thomas didn't care about fame. He had gotten what he came for, a young woman in the crowd. A journalist covering royal events watched Thomas's retreating figure. Something about the moment gnawed at her instincts. This wasn't random. This was a story. She decided to follow him. Thomas walked for 20 minutes, unaware he was being tracked. He moved through narrow streets and back alleys, finally stopping at a small cemetery in Southern. The gates were old iron, rusted at the hinges. He entered without hesitation. Walked straight to a grave in the corner, beneath a willow tree. The journalist hung back, hidden behind a stone monument. She watched as Thomas knelt at the grave, saw him trace the name carved into the headstone with fingers that shook. She couldn't read the name from her distance, but she saw Thomas's shoulders shake. Saw him press his forehead against the cold stone, saw him weep, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that the moment at the palace wasn't a performance, it was a memorial. Something had happened to Thomas Webb, something that connected him to the military. To honor, to a loss so deep, it required a public act of remembrance. The journalist pulled out her phone, snapped a photo of the grave from a distance. She would research this, find out who was buried there, understand the story behind the salute, because stories like this didn't just happen. They had roots. They had reasons, and she was going to uncover every single one. The journalist's name was Sarah Chen, 28, sharp, persistent. Kind of reporter who didn't let stories go until she understood them completely. She waited until Thomas left the cemetery before approaching the grave. The willow branches swayed overhead, casting shifting shadows on the worn headstone. She knelt down. Read the inscription carved into the gray stone. Lieutenant James Webb, 1995-2019, beloved son. Brave soldier, his music lives on. Sarah's breath caught. The pieces started connecting. Thomas wasn't just a random street performer. He was a father, and his son had been a soldier. She pulled out her notebook, wrote down the details. Lieutenant James Webb died in 2019. She would need to research military records, find out what happened, understand why a father would dress as a joker and play accordion outside a palace. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment, laptop open, diving into archives, military databases, news reports, obituaries. She found James Webb's service record. He had been part of the King's Guard, the very regiment that stood watch at Buckingham Palace. He served with distinction, received commendations. Then she found the report that explained everything. James had died during a training exercise, a vehicle accident, sudden, tragic. He was 24 years old. But the detail that made Sarah's chest tighten was this. James had been a musician before he enlisted. He played accordion. Learned it from his father. Thomas had taught his son music, then watched him trade the accordion for a rifle. Watched him serve his country with the same discipline he once applied to melodies, and then watched him die. Sarah dug deeper. Found an interview from 5 years ago, before James's death. A local newspaper piece about street performers in London. There was a photo. Thomas and James together, both holding accordions, both smiling. The caption read, "Father-son duo brings joy to Camden Market with traditional folk music." Thomas looked different in the photo, younger, alive in a way that went beyond age. His eyes sparkled. His smile was genuine. The man at the palace today looked like a shadow of that person. Sarah found more. After James's death, Thomas had stopped performing at markets. Stopped taking gigs. His wife had left him a year later. Couldn't handle the grief that consumed their home. Thomas was alone, broken, clinging to the only connection he had left to his son. Music, the Joker costume. Sarah realized wasn't random either. James had loved comics. Batman was his favorite. The Joker, he once said in that old interview, represented chaos, finding its own twisted form of order. Maybe Thomas wore it as tribute, or maybe he wore it because he felt like a joke himself. A father who couldn't save his son. A performer who had lost his audience. Sarah closed her laptop, stared at the wall. This wasn't just a story. This was a man's entire world collapsed into a single moment of desperate remembrance. She needed to talk to him. The next morning, Sarah returned to the cemetery. Thomas was there again, sitting on the ground beside James's grave. The accordion rested in his lap. He wasn't playing, just holding it. Like holding a memory, Sarah approached slowly, cleared her throat. Thomas looked up, startled. "I don't want to intrude," Sarah said gently. "My name is Sarah. I was at the palace yesterday. I saw what happened." Thomas's face closed off. "I'm not looking for publicity. That's not why I'm here." Hey. She sat down on the grass, keeping distance between them. "I'm here because I want to understand, if you're willing to tell me." Thomas was silent for a long time. His fingers traced the accordion keys without pressing them. Finally, he spoke. "He used to stand at that post, the exact spot where that guard was yesterday." His voice was rough, unused to conversation. "James, my boy, he was so proud to serve, so proud to wear that uniform." Sarah listened, didn't interrupt. "He'd come home on leave and play accordion with me. Said it kept him human. Reminded him there was beauty in the world beyond orders and discipline." Thomas's eyes glistened. "The day he died, I was playing at Covent Garden. Someone called me. It told me there had been an accident. By the time I got to the hospital, he was gone." A tear rolled down his cheek, cutting through the faded Joker paint he still wore. "I couldn't play anymore after that. Every note reminded me of him. Every melody felt empty." He looked down at the accordion. "But last month was the 5th anniversary of his death, and I realized I was dishonoring his memory by staying silent. He would have wanted the music to continue." Sarah felt her own eyes burning. "So you went to the palace?" Thomas nodded. "I went to his post. Played the song his grandmother used to sing to him. The one he requested most. I went to tell him I'm sorry. Sorry I couldn't protect him. Sorry the world took him before I was ready." His voice broke. "And I needed to honor him the way he deserved. As a soldier. So I saluted. And the guard saluted back," Sarah whispered. "I don't know why he did. He broke protocol. Could probably get in trouble." Thomas smiled sadly. "But for 3 seconds, I felt like James was there. Like someone was telling me he heard the music. That he knew I still loved him." They sat in silence. The willow branches rustled overhead. Somewhere nearby, birds sang. Sarah made a decision then. "Thomas, I'm a journalist, and I think people need to hear this story. Not for sensationalism, but because grief is universal. Loss is universal. And what you did yesterday was one of the most beautiful acts of love I've ever witnessed." Thomas looked at her warily. "I don't want to be on television. I don't want fame. You don't have to be. I'll write the story. Protect your privacy as much as I can. But that guard who saluted you, he deserves recognition too. He showed humanity when he didn't have to. That matters." Thomas considered this. "What was his name?" "The guard." Sarah shook her head. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Thomas stood slowly, joints protesting. He extended a hand to help Sarah up. "If you write this, tell people one thing. Tell them that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to express itself." Sarah shook his hand. "I will." As she walked away, she glanced back once. Thomas had knelt at the grave again, accordion in his arms. Beginning to play softly, the melody drifted through the cemetery. Sad but beautiful. A father's song for his son. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was holding a story that would touch millions. Now, she just needed to find the guard who had the courage to break the rules for a grieving father. Finding the guard's identity wasn't easy. The military protected their personnel. Names weren't publicly listed. Sarah couldn't just call Buckingham Palace and ask, but she had the video. Hundreds of people had filmed the moment. She downloaded every angle she could find. Studied the guard's face, his build, the medals on his uniform. Then she did something unconventional. She posted on military family forums, shared a carefully cropped screenshot of the guard's face, asked if anyone recognized him. Within 6 hours, she got a response. Yes, Private Daniel Morrison. My nephew. He's stationed with the King's Guard. Sarah's heart raced. She sent a private message. Explained she was a journalist. Explained the story. Asked if there was any way to contact Daniel. The aunt was hesitant at first. Protective, but Sarah sent her the full context. Thomas's story. James's death. The meaning behind the salute. The aunt's response came an hour later. Daniel knew Lieutenant Webb. They served together briefly before James died. I'll ask if he's willing to talk to you. No promises. Sarah waited 3 agonizing days. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. This is Private Morrison. The voice was young, cautious. My aunt said you wanted to talk about what happened at the palace. Sarah grabbed her recorder. Daniel, thank you for calling. I know what you did was against protocol. I'm not here to get you in trouble. I'm here because I think what you did was incredibly brave. Silence on the other end. Then, I shouldn't have broken formation. I've been reprimanded already, but I don't regret it. Can you tell me why you did it? Daniel took a deep breath. Lieutenant Webb was my squad leader for 3 months before his accident. He was the best officer I ever served under. Patient, fair. He actually cared about us as people, not just soldiers. His voice grew emotional. James used to talk about his dad, about playing music together, about how his father taught him that discipline and art weren't opposites, that you could be both a warrior and a musician. Sarah felt chills. You recognized Thomas, not at first. But when he started playing that accordion, something clicked. James used to hum that same melody during long watches. Said it reminded him of home. Daniel paused, and then the man saluted. A proper military salute, and I saw it in his eyes. The grief, the pride, the desperate need to honor someone he loved. So you saluted back. I had to. James would have wanted me to. He taught me that honor isn't just about following rules. It's about recognizing sacrifice. And that man sacrificed his comfort, his dignity, everything. It's just to honor his son in front of the place where James served. How could I not acknowledge that? Sarah's eyes watered. Are you going to face serious consequences? Daniel laughed softly. My commanding officer pulled me aside, said what I did was completely unacceptable. Then he shook my hand and told me he would have done the same thing. I have to write an incident report, attend some extra training, but nothing major. The video has millions of views now. You've become a symbol of compassion. I don't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to honor James and let his father know his son was loved, that we haven't forgotten him. Sarah wiped her eyes. Would you be willing to meet Thomas? To tell him that yourself? Long pause. I don't know if I can. What would I say? Sorry, your son died on my watch. You weren't responsible for James's death. I know. But guilt doesn't listen to logic. Daniel's voice cracked. I think about him every day. Wonder what he'd be doing now if he'd lived. If he'd still be in the Guard, or if he'd have gone back to music. Sarah made a decision. I'm going to give you Thomas's number. You don't have to call. But I think you both need this conversation. Not for my story. For yourselves. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Then, okay, give it to me. Sarah sent the contact information after they hung up. Then she waited. 2 days passed. She checked in with Thomas. He hadn't heard from Daniel. She worried she'd overstepped, that Daniel had gotten cold feet. Then, on the 3rd evening, her phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. He called. We're meeting tomorrow. Thank you. Sarah sat back, stunned. She hadn't expected it to happen so fast. The next morning, she convinced Thomas to let her be present. not to intrude, but to witness. This was the heart of the story. The connection between two men bound by loss and love for the same person. They met at a quiet cafe in Kensington. Early morning, before the tourist crowds. Thomas arrived first, wearing normal clothes this time. No Joker costume. Just a gray sweater and worn jeans. He looked terrified. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later. Out of uniform, in a simple jacket and slacks. He looked young. Barely older than James had been when he died. They saw each other. Froze Sarah, held her breath. Then Daniel crossed the cafe in 3 long strides, and he hugged Thomas. Not a formal embrace. A real, desperate hug. The kind that said, "I needed this more than I knew." Thomas stood rigid for a moment, shocked. Then his arms came up. He held the young soldier like he might hold a son. They stayed that way for a long moment, both trembling, both crying quietly. When they finally separated, they sat down. Sarah kept her distance, at a corner table. Recorder on, but discreet. "I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner," Daniel said, his voice rough. "After the accident, I didn't know what to say. How to face you." Thomas shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You served with my son. That's enough. He talked about you all the time. About your music. About growing up watching you perform. He was so proud to be your son." Thomas's face crumpled. "I was proud to be his father." They talked for 2 hours. Daniel shared stories Thomas had never heard. Moments from James's service. Jokes he told. Times he showed kindness to younger soldiers. Pieces of his son's life that had been lost to death. Thomas listened, hungry for every detail. Every memory, every confirmation that his son had been loved and remembered, and slowly something shifted in both of them. The guilt Daniel carried began to ease. The isolation Thomas felt began to crack. He used to say, Daniel said softly, that if he died in service, he hoped someone would play accordion at his funeral, but there wasn't time. Everything happened so fast. Thomas looked up. "I never got to play for him. I couldn't. I was too broken. Maybe you could now," Daniel suggested gently. "Maybe we both could honor him properly, together." What? Thomas's eyes widened. "You play?" Daniel smiled sadly. "James taught me a little. I'm terrible, but I remember the basics." And in that moment, the story found its true ending. Not in the viral video. Not in the palace salute, but in 2 people, connected by grief. Deciding to honor the dead through music and memory, Sarah watched from her corner table, tears streaming down her face. This was why she became a journalist. Not for headlines, but for moments like this. When humanity revealed itself in its most vulnerable, beautiful form, she would write the story. But she knew now that the real story wasn't what millions saw on camera. It was what was happening right now. In a quiet cafe, between a father and a soldier who both loved the same person. The memorial concert was planned for 3 weeks later. Not a big production, just something intimate, meaningful. A proper goodbye to Lieutenant James Webb. Thomas and Daniel organized it together. They chose the location carefully. Not the cemetery. Not a concert hall. But James's favorite place in all of London, the Embankment Gardens. A small park along the Thames where James used to sit during leave, watching the river flow, playing accordion for anyone who would listen. Sarah helped spread the word. Posted about it on social media. Reached out to James's old military unit. 2 street performers who remembered Thomas from his busking days. To anyone whose life James had touched, she expected maybe 30 people to show up. 50 at most, 300 came. The morning of the memorial was bright and cold. Autumn leaves covered the grass in gold and red. The Thames reflected the sky like hammered silver. Thomas arrived early, carrying 2 accordions, his own, worn from decades of use, and James's, which had been stored in a closet for 5 years, untouched since his son's death. Daniel was already there, wearing his dress uniform. Not required, but he wanted James to be honored properly. Around them, people gathered. Veterans in uniform. Street performers with instruments. Neighbors who remembered James as a boy, teachers from his school, friends from his childhood, and, unexpectedly, a group of 15 Royal Guards, off-duty in civilian clothes. They stood together, silent and respectful. Their commanding officer stood with them. A gray-haired man with medals covering his chest, Daniel approached them, surprised. "Sir, I didn't expect." The commanding officer cut him off. "Lieutenant Webb was one of ours. We honor our own." Thomas watched this gathering crowd, overwhelmed. He had thought he would be playing for a handful of people. Instead, he was looking at an ocean of faces, all here for his son. Sarah stood at the back, camera ready, but keeping it low-key. This wasn't about getting footage. This was about bearing witness. At precisely 2 o'clock, Daniel called for attention. His voice carried across the park, strong and clear. Military training showing through. "We're here today to honor Lieutenant James Webb, soldier's son, friend, musician." He paused, emotion threatening to break through. James believed that life was meant to be lived fully, that duty and joy weren't opposites, that a man could serve his country and still make beauty in the world. People nodded. A few wiped their eyes. Today his father Thomas is going to play the songs James loved most, and I'm going to attempt to play with him, even though I'll probably be terrible. That got a small laugh, easing the tension. But James would have wanted this. Music, community, remembrance. Thomas stood, lifted his accordion. His hands shook so badly he almost couldn't start. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Daniel, standing beside him with James's accordion. The younger man's touch was steady. Grounding, Thomas took a breath, found his courage, and began to play. The melody started soft. That same folk song he had played at the palace. The one James's grandmother used to sing. The notes drifted across the park, simple and pure. Daniel joined in, clumsy at first, struggling to remember the chords James had taught him. But he found the rhythm, followed Thomas's lead. The song grew, filled the space between them, filled the park, filled the hearts of everyone listening. Some people began to hum along, then more, until 300 voices joined the accordions in wordless harmony. Thomas closed his eyes, felt the music move through him, and for the first time since James died, he didn't feel alone. When the song ended, silence held for 3 heartbeats, then applause. Not loud or dramatic, just respectful, acknowledging. Thomas lowered his accordion, looked at the crowd. "My son loved this park." He said it reminded him that London was worth protecting. That beauty existed even in a city of millions. He played here whenever he could, made people smile, made them stop and listen. His voice grew stronger. "I stopped playing after he died. Stopped believing music mattered, but James would be angry with me for that. He'd tell me that music is how we remember, how we honor, how we keep the dead alive in our hearts." Thomas held up James's accordion. This was his. He played it better than I ever could, and today I'm giving it to someone who knew him, who served with him, who saluted his memory when it mattered most. He turned to Daniel, extended the accordion toward him. "James would want you to have this, would want the music to continue." Daniel stared at the instrument. Tears streamed down his face. "I can't." "That's yours. That's his. And now it's yours," Thomas said firmly. "Play it badly at first, maybe, but play it. Let James's music live on." Daniel took the accordion with trembling hands, held it like something sacred. "I'll honor this, I promise." The commanding officer stepped forward then. He addressed the crowd. "The King's Guard doesn't typically make public statements, but Lieutenant Webb was exceptional. His loss was felt deeply." He looked at Thomas. "Mr. Webb, your son served with distinction. His memory inspires us daily. And what you did at the palace, what Private Morrison did in response, reminded all of us why we serve. Not just for duty, but for love, for family, for the people who sacrifice alongside us." He saluted Thomas. Sharp, formal, perfect, and every veteran in the crowd saluted with him. 15 Royal Guards. Old soldiers in wheelchairs, young recruits barely out of training, all of them honoring a father's grief and a son's service. Thomas returned the salute. This time, his hand didn't shake. This time, he felt the weight of tradition and respect flowing through the gesture. When the salutes dropped, a commanding officer approached, pressed something into Thomas's hand, a medal. James's service medal, which had been kept in military records. "This belongs with you," the officer said quietly. "He earned it. You earned it, too, by raising a man worth honoring." Thomas couldn't speak, could only nod. Clutched the medal to his chest. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. People came forward, shared memories, told stories Thomas had never heard, each one a gift. Each one proof that his son's life had mattered. Daniel played James's accordion several more times, getting slightly better with each song. Thomas accompanied him, guiding him through the difficult parts. They sounded good together. Not perfect, but real, honest, exactly what James would have wanted. As the sun set over the Thames, painting the water orange and gold, the crowd began to disperse. People hugged Thomas, thanked him, promised to remember. Finally, only Thomas, Daniel, and Sarah remained. They sat on a bench, overlooking the river, exhausted, emotionally wrung out, but lighter somehow, unburdened. "He was here," Thomas said softly. "I felt him. In the music, in the faces. He was here." Daniel nodded. "He's always here. Wherever people remember him with love." Sarah looked at both of them. These two men who had found each other through grief and transformed it into something beautiful. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me witness this. For trusting me with James's story." Thomas smiled. A real smile. The first she'd seen from him. Write it well. Let people know that love doesn't end. It just changes shape. And she would. She would write the story of the Joker and the Guard, the viral video that connected them. But more importantly, she would write about this. The memorial, the healing, the community that gathered around loss and made it bearable, because that was the real story. Not the moment that went viral, but the moments that came after. When people chose connection over isolation. When they chose to honor the dead by living fully. When they chose love. Sarah's article was published a week later in a major London newspaper. The headline read, "The Salute That Healed Two Hearts," inside the viral moment at Buckingham Palace. It went viral immediately. Shared millions of times, translated into dozens of languages, featured on morning shows, discussed on podcasts. But the response wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of just commenting and moving on, people began sharing their own stories. Veterans wrote about comrades they'd lost. Parents wrote about children taken too soon. Musicians wrote about playing through grief. The article became a repository for collective mourning, a place where strangers felt safe admitting their pain. One comment stood out. It came from a woman named Margaret Chen, living in Singapore. "My brother was in James Webb's unit. He survived the same training exercise that killed James. He's been consumed by guilt ever since. Won't talk about it. Won't get help. If Daniel Morrison and Thomas Webb can find healing together, maybe there's hope for my brother too." Sarah saw the comment. Tracked down Margaret's contact information. Called her. "My brother's name is Alex," Margaret explained. "He was driving the vehicle that day. He blames himself, even though the investigation cleared him. It was mechanical failure. Not his fault. But he won't accept that." Sarah's heart sank. "Is he willing to talk?" "I don't know. He refuses therapy. Refuses to engage with anyone from his old unit. He just works and sleeps. He's barely alive." Sarah made a decision. "Can I give you Thomas's number? Maybe hearing from James's father would help." Margaret was skeptical. Why would a grieving father want to talk to the man who was driving when his son died? Because Thomas understands that blame doesn't bring anyone back, and forgiveness is the only thing that lets us move forward. 2 days later, Thomas's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Webb. The voice was male, young, shaking. My name is Alex Chen. I was with your son when he died. Thomas sat down heavily. He had wondered about the others in that vehicle. Wondered who survived. What they remembered. Go on, Thomas said quietly. I was driving. The brakes failed. James and I were thrown. I had a seatbelt on. He was checking equipment in the back. He didn't. Alex's voice broke. I should have made him wear the belt. I should have checked the vehicle more carefully. I should have stopped. Thomas's voice was firm but not harsh. Were you responsible for vehicle maintenance? No. But did you intentionally disable the brakes? Of course not. Then you didn't kill my son. Circumstance did. Chance did. Bad luck did. Thomas took a breath. Alex, I've spent 5 years being angry. At the universe, at fate, at myself for not keeping James safe. But anger doesn't bring him back. It just makes the living suffer longer. Silence on the other end. Then sobbing. Deep, guttural sobbing that sounded like it had been held in for years. Thomas waited. Let the young man cry. Offered the only thing he could. Presence. Understanding. When Alex could speak again, he whispered, How do you forgive me? There's nothing to forgive. You survived. He didn't. That's tragedy, not crime. Thomas paused. But if you need to hear it, I forgive you, Alex. Completely. Without reservation. More crying. Then, what do I do now? You live, fully, loudly. You honor James by not wasting the life he didn't get to finish. You play music if that's your calling. You serve others. You find joy again. That's what he would want. They talked for an hour. Thomas answered every question, shared every memory, gave Alex permission to stop punishing himself. When they hung up, Thomas called Sarah. Another one found me. Another soldier carrying guilt. Sarah realized then that the story was bigger than one viral video. It was about a community of people touched by military loss. Finding each other through shared pain, she wrote a follow-up article. The ripple effect. How one father's tribute is healing others. More messages poured in. More veterans. More grieving families. Thomas responded to as many as he could. Daniel helped. He created a support group. Called it James's Legacy. Space for military families to gather, share stories, heal together. Thomas played accordion at every meeting. Daniel played beside him, improving each time. The group grew. 20 people became 50. 50 became 100. They met in community centers, in parks, anywhere they could gather and remember together. One evening, 6 months after the palace incident, Thomas received a letter, official, stamped. With the royal sealed inside was an invitation. Mr. Thomas Webb is cordially invited to perform at the annual Remembrance Day ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The King's Guard requests his presence to honor fallen soldiers through music. Thomas stared at the invitation, hands shaking. This was official recognition, not just of his son, but of his grief, of his music, of his refusal to let loss be the end. He called Daniel immediately. They want me to play at Westminster Abbey. Daniel laughed, delighted. You have to do it. I can't do it alone. You won't. I'll be there. The whole support group will be there. You're not alone anymore, Thomas. Remembrance Day arrived, cold and gray. Westminster Abbey was packed. Dignitaries, royal family members, hundreds of veterans and military families. Thomas stood in the staging area, accordion strapped across his chest. He wore a proper suit this time. No Joker costume. That had served its purpose. This moment required something different. Daniel stood beside him in full dress uniform, holding James's accordion. Around them, 20 members of James's legacy waited, some with instruments, some just there for support. The ceremony began. Speeches about sacrifice, about duty, about remembering those who gave everything. Then Thomas was called forward. He walked to the center of the abbey, looked up at the vaulted ceiling. at the stained glass filtering colored light, at the faces of people who understood loss intimately, he began to play. The same folk song. James's favorite, but this time it sounded different. Not sad. Not mournful, hopeful. Daniel joined in. Then others from the support group added harmonies. Guitars, violins, voices. The music swelled. Filled the ancient space. Became something bigger than any individual contribution. And Thomas realized something profound. Grief didn't have to be solitary. Loss didn't have to isolate. When shared, when expressed through beauty, it became communal. It became bearable. The song ended. Silence held for a long moment. Then the entire abbey stood and applauded. Not polite golf claps. Real, sustained applause. Recognition. Gratitude. Acknowledgement. Thomas bowed. Tears streaming down his face. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release. After the ceremony, the king's commanding officer approached. "Mr. Webb, that was extraordinary." The king himself was moved. He asked me to convey his personal gratitude. Thomas shook his hand. "Thank you. For letting me honor James this way, we should thank you. You've reminded us all why we serve, who we serve for." As people filed out of the abbey, many stopped to thank Thomas, to share their own stories, to find connection in shared experience. One woman, elderly and using a cane, gripped his hand. "My husband died in the Falklands. I haven't been able to listen to music since, but today, hearing you play, I remembered why he loved it. Thank you for giving that back to me." Thomas hugged her. "Thank you for listening." Outside the abbey, Sarah stood with her camera, documenting everything. She had pitched a book. A publisher agreed. The story of the Joker and the guard was becoming something permanent, something that would outlive them all. Thomas found Daniel in the crowd. They stood together, looking back at the abbey. "He would have been proud," Daniel said. "James, he would have loved this." Thomas nodded. "I think he knows. Somehow, what's next for you?" Daniel asked. "You've accomplished so much." Thomas smiled. "I'm going to keep playing. Keep building the community. Keep honoring him. Not through grand gestures. Just through showing up. Every day. That's the real memorial." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "I'll be there with you." And he was. They both were. Every meeting. Every performance. Every moment of healing. The viral video was still shared occasionally. People still commented. Still marveled at the guard who broke protocol. But Thomas and Daniel knew the truth. The video was just the beginning. The real story was what came after. The connections forged. The healing shared. The community built on love and loss and refusal to let grief have the final word. That was James's legacy, not his death. But how his death inspired others to live more fully, to love more openly, to honor memory through action, and every time Thomas played accordion, every time Daniel joined him. They kept that legacy alive, not through grand monuments or official recognition, but through the simple, powerful act of making beauty in a broken world. 3 years after the palace incident, Thomas received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was formal, professional, but warm. "Mr. Webb, this is Colonel Harrison from the Ministry of Defense. We'd like to discuss establishing a permanent memorial for Lieutenant James Webb and others who died in training. We believe your advocacy has highlighted an overlooked aspect of military loss." Thomas was stunned. "A memorial? How?" "We're proposing a garden at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. A space dedicated to soldiers who died not in combat, but in preparation for it. We'd like your input on the design. And we'd like James's name to be the first inscribed." Thomas had to sit down. "Yes. Absolutely yes." The garden took a year to complete. Thomas visited the site monthly, watching it take shape. Stone pathways. Benches inscribed with names. A central fountain that played actual music. Piped through hidden speakers playing recordings of military musicians. And at the center, a bronze statue. A soldier playing accordion. Based on photographs of James, the dedication ceremony was scheduled for November 11th, Remembrance Day, exactly 4 years after Thomas first stood outside Buckingham's palace in a Joker costume. The night before the ceremony, Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked to James's grave, something he still did regularly, but this time felt different, final in some way. He sat on the cold ground, back against the headstone. Tomorrow, they're unveiling your statue. A whole garden in your honor. Well, in honor of everyone who fell in training, but you're the face of it. The wind rustled through the willow branches. Thomas smiled. I wish you could see it. Not because you'd want the attention. You'd hate that. But because it means your death meant something. That others won't be forgotten the way I feared you'd be forgotten. He pulled out his accordion, played softly. The melody he'd played 1,000 times now. The one that started everything. I'm not angry anymore. At the universe, at fate. At the cruel randomness that took you. His voice caught. I'm grateful. Grateful I got 24 years with you. Grateful you left behind people who loved you. Grateful your death brought others together instead of tearing them apart. He finished the song. Sat in silence. Then stood, knees protesting. Okay, son. Let's go show the world who you were. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds. Veterans, military families, government officials, members of parliament, and, to Thomas's surprise, members of the royal family. Prince William attended personally. Spoke briefly about the importance of honoring all military deaths, not just those in combat. Training deaths are tragedies compounded by their preventability, the prince said. We owe it to these soldiers and their families to ensure their loss drives improvement in safety, in support, in remembrance. This garden stands as a promise that no military death will be invisible. Then Thomas was called to speak. He approached the podium slowly, looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most strangers, all there because his son's death had mattered. I'm not good with speeches, he began. I'm a musician. I speak through melody, not words. But today, I need to say something. He took a breath. 4 years ago, I dressed as a joker and played accordion outside Buckingham Palace. I did it because I was desperate, because grief was eating me alive, because I needed to honor my son in the only way I knew how. People nodded. Many knew the story. A guard saluted me that day, Private Daniel Morrison. He broke protocol. Risked his career, because he recognized that sometimes humanity matters more than rules. That gesture changed everything. It gave me permission to grieve publicly, to connect with others, to build something meaningful from loss. He gestured to the garden around them. This space exists because one person had the courage to acknowledge pain. Because communities formed around shared loss. Because we refused to let death be the end of the story. His voice grew stronger. James died doing what he believed in, serving his country, preparing to protect others. His death was senseless, preventable, tragic, but we get to choose what comes after. We get to decide if his loss means something. He looked directly at the statue of his son, Bronze James, frozen mid-performance, accordion in his arms. This garden means something. Every name on these walls means something. Not because they died, but because we refuse to forget them. Thomas stepped back from the podium, picked up his accordion. I'm going to play now, and I invite anyone who knew someone whose name is on these walls to come forward. Stand with me. Help me honor them. He began to play. The folk song. James's song. The melody that started everything. Daniel came forward first, joined with James's accordion, then others. 50 people. Some with instruments. Some just standing in solidarity. The music filled the garden, spilled into the surrounding streets, drew people from nearby buildings who came to see what was happening. And in that moment, Thomas understood something he'd been searching for since James died. Meaning wasn't something you found. It was something you created. Through choice, through action, through refusing to let loss be the final word. After the ceremony, families approached the walls. found their loved ones' names, traced them with fingers, wept, smiled, remembered. Thomas watched them, accordion still strapped to his chest. Sarah stood beside him, no longer documenting, just present. "You did this," she said quietly. "This garden, this community, this healing. It came from you refusing to grieve alone." Thomas shook his head. "It came from Daniel having the courage to salute. From you having the courage to tell the story. From every person who read it and decided to share their own pain. I was just the catalyst. The community did the work." An elderly man approached, military bearing, despite his age. "Mr. Webb, my name is Colonel James Morrison, Daniel's father." Thomas shook his hand. "It's an honor. I wanted to thank you. My son talks about you constantly. Says you saved his life. That he was drowning in guilt and purposelessness until he met you." Thomas's eyes widened. "He saved mine," Colonel Morrison smiled. "That's how healing works. We save each other." As the sun set, casting golden light across the garden, Thomas found himself alone with the statue. He reached up, touched the bronze accordion. "I did it, James. I honored you. Not just today, every day. Through music, through community, through love." He paused. "I'm going to keep doing it. For as long as I'm here, that's my promise to you." The statue stared forward, eternal and unchanging. But Thomas felt response in the way evening birds sang, in the way wind moved through newly planted trees, in the way peace settled over his shoulders like a familiar coat. He turned to leave, found Daniel waiting at the garden gate. "Ready to go play at the support group meeting?" Daniel asked. Thomas smiled. "Always." They walked together through London streets. Two men carrying accordions, heading to a community center where 50 others waited. People still healing, still grieving, still learning to live with loss. This was the real memorial. Not bronze statues or government ceremonies, but the weekly gathering of broken people choosing to be broken together, choosing to make music despite the pain, choosing life despite death's proximity. They reached the community center. Inside, familiar faces greeted them. Alex Chen was there, teaching a young woman whose brother had died in service. Margaret had flown in from Singapore for the garden dedication and decided to stay for the support group. Thomas set up his accordion. Daniel did the same. Around them, others prepared instruments or simply found seats. "What should we play tonight?" someone asked. Thomas thought for a moment, then smiled. "Something new, something hopeful. James would want us moving forward, not staying stuck in the past." They played for 2 hours. Old songs and new. Sad melodies and joyful ones. Music that carried grief and music that celebrated survival. When the meeting ended, people hugged. Made plans to see each other next week. Checked in on those who seemed particularly struggling. Thomas was the last to leave. He stood in the empty community center, accordion in hand, looking at the chairs still arranged in a circle. 4 years ago, he was alone, broken, convinced life had ended when James died. Now he was surrounded by people who understood, who carried their own losses, who chose every single day to keep living despite the pain. The viral video was ancient history now. People had moved on to new scandals, new stories, new moments. But the community it sparked remained, growing, healing, becoming something James would have been proud of. Thomas locked up the community center, walked to the bus stop. An ordinary evening in an ordinary life. Except it wasn't ordinary. It was extraordinary, because he had taken the worst moment of his life and transformed it into connection, into purpose, into legacy. The bus arrived. Thomas boarded, found a seat by the window, watched London roll past. Somewhere in this city, his son's statue stood in a garden bearing his name. But the real memorial was here, in the living, in the healing, in the stubborn refusal to let death define everything. Thomas closed his eyes, felt the accordion's weight on his lap, felt peace. He had honored his son, not through grief, but through love. And that, finally, was enough. The bus moved through evening traffic, carrying a father home, carrying a story forward, carrying proof that even in the darkest moments, humanity could choose light. The Joker and the Guard. The viral video that became a movement. The salute that healed 2 hearts and sparked healing in thousands more. That was the real story. Not the moment caught on camera, but everything that came after. When people chose connection over isolation, when they chose to build memorials not from stone but from community, when they chose to honor the dead by living fully, Thomas opened his eyes, smiled. Tomorrow, he would wake up. He would play music. He would attend another support group meeting. He would answer emails from people seeking help with their own grief. Ordinary days. Extraordinary purpose. And somewhere he believed James was watching, proud, at peace. The music continued. The healing continued. The story continued. Because that's what love does. It refuses to end. It just changes form. Becomes something new. Something that outlives death itself. Thomas got off at his stop, walked to his small flat, made tea sat by the window. And as night fell over London, he picked up his accordion one more time, played softly, just for himself, just for James, a father's lullaby for a son who would never age, a promise kept, a legacy honored, a life lived in service of love. That was the story's end, but also its beginning, because healing isn't a destination. It's a practice, a choice, a daily commitment to moving forward while carrying the past gently. Thomas closed his eyes. Let the music carry him. Let the memories hold him. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The Joker had found his purpose. The Guard had found his peace. And together, they had built something that would outlast them both. A community. A garden. A reminder that grief, when shared, becomes bearable. And love, when expressed, becomes eternal.